The station smelled like recycled air and old metal. Saraval had noticed that the moment she stepped off the Verith transport vessel and set foot on the neutral ground of Verith Prime. She had been to dozens of stations before, but this one felt different. This one felt like the beginning of something she could not take back. She stood near the large observation window at the end of the greeting hall, watching the stars, letting the cold quiet of space settle her nerves. Behind her, her attendants were making final adjustments to her ceremonial robe, a deep violet fabric trimmed with silver thread that marked her as a daughter of the High Empress. She did not need reminding. She had been a daughter of the Empire her entire life. The war had lasted 3 years. 3 years of Verith ships pushing into human-held space, and 3 years of humans pushing back harder than anyone expected. The Verith Military Council had gone into the conflict confident. They had numbers, they had ancient strategy, and they had weapons that had broken a dozen civilizations before. But the humans had something the Council had not accounted for. They simply refused to stop fighting. By the 2nd year, the casualty counts on the Verith side were staggering. By the 3rd year, the High Empress herself had called a private meeting and used a word that no Verith ruler had spoken aloud in 2 centuries. Retreat. The peace treaty had been Saraval's mother's idea. A political marriage, binding the 2 species at the highest symbolic level, buying time for both sides to step back from the edge. And Saraval, standing in the greeting hall of Verith Prime, had volunteered herself before anyone else could be chosen. She told herself it was duty. She told herself she was strong enough to manage it. She heard footsteps behind her. Not her attendants. The stride was different. Slower. Calm in a way that felt deliberate. She turned. The human was not what she expected. She had studied human military personnel before the treaty discussions began, and she had built a picture in her mind of what a decorated soldier would look like. Broad, loud, wearing his status on his face. The man walking toward her was none of those things. He was tall, lean in the way that suggested he had been moving his body for years without stopping, and his expression was quiet. Not nervous. Not performing. Just present. His name was Cole Harmon. She had read his file. 17 campaigns. Dozens of engagements. Decorations that filled 2 pages. And yet the man crossing the greeting hall toward her looked like someone who had forgotten to be impressive. He stopped a respectful distance away and inclined his head in the Verith greeting gesture. He had learned it. He had actually taken the time to learn it. She said his name aloud as a formal acknowledgement. He replied with hers, pronouncing it correctly, which surprised her more than she wanted to admit. They walked side by side to the signing chamber, and he did not speak unless she spoke first. He did not fill the silence with nervous talk. He simply walked and breathed and watched everything around him with eyes that missed nothing. The ceremony was short. It was not a Verith wedding by any traditional measure, and it was not a human one either. It was a legal binding witnessed by diplomats from 4 species, recorded in 3 languages, and completed in under 20 minutes. Saraval signed her name in the Verith script. Cole signed his in the clean, simple lines of the human alphabet. And that was that. They were walking out through the main corridor when it happened. One of the Verith honor guards standing along the wall muttered something under his breath. It was quiet, barely a sound, but the words were a human slur that had been popular on Verith military bases during the war. Saraval heard it. She felt her jaw tighten. Cole heard it too. She could tell by the way his pace did not change, did not hesitate, did not falter by even a single step. He simply turned his head and looked at the guard. Just looked. No words. No expression beyond a kind of flat, patient attention. The guard went pale. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, went very still. He stared straight ahead and did not move again. Cole turned back and kept walking. Saraval walked beside him and said nothing. But she kept thinking about the guard's face. She had seen fear before. She had seen it in battle reports, in the eyes of subordinates who had made mistakes, in the faces of officials receiving bad news. What she had seen on that guard's face was something older and simpler than political fear. It was the kind of fear that lived in the body. She did not know what to make of it. She told herself she would figure it out later. She told herself she had time. Outside the window, the stars did not offer any answers. They rarely did. The imperial capital of Kethera was beautiful in the way that old things often were. Wide stone streets, towers that caught the morning light and scattered it in long amber bands across the city, gardens that had been tended by the same families for generations. Saraval had grown up inside its palace walls. She had always thought it was the most impressive place in the known galaxy. Cole Harmon looked at it the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand, and that bothered her in a way she could not immediately explain. They had been given adjoining chambers in the east wing of the palace, connected by a shared sitting room that neither of them had yet used. Saraval kept to her side. Cole kept to his. She expected this to be the shape of things. A formal arrangement. Clean borders. Mutual indifference. On the third morning, she could not sleep. She rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon and moved to the window of her chamber, intending to watch the city wake up. Instead, she looked down into the courtyard below and stopped. Cole was already there. He was alone, wearing plain dark training clothes, and he was working through a series of movements that she recognized vaguely as human combat conditioning. What she did not recognize was the weight he was lifting. It was a training stone used by the Palace Guard Corps, designed for the largest and strongest of the Verith soldiers. He was moving it like it weighed nothing. Not showing off. Not even breathing hard. Just working, steadily and quietly, in the gray light of early morning. She stood at the window for longer than she intended. Later that day she called her senior advisor, a careful old man named Vel Hor, and asked him to pull everything on Cole Harmon's war record. Not the summaries she had already read. Everything. What came back took her 3 hours to read. 72 confirmed combat engagements. 3 solo extraction missions, each of which had been classified at the time they occurred. A commendation that was still sealed above her clearance level, which meant whatever he had done to earn it, the human military did not want other governments knowing about it. Reports from commanding officers that used words like relentless, adaptive, and one that simply said he does not stop. She set the files down and looked at the ceiling for a while. That evening there was a state dinner. It was a formal affair, attended by members of the noble houses and several visiting dignitaries, including a duke from the outer provinces who had been loudly critical of the peace treaty in public forums. Saraval had expected this dinner to be unpleasant. She had prepared remarks. She did not need them. The duke waited until the second course and then made a comment, aimed generally at the table but clearly directed at Cole, implying that the treaty was a form of surrender and that Saraval had diminished her house by entering into it. He phrased it elegantly, the way that experienced men phrase cruelty, so it could be denied later. Cole set his fork down. He picked up his water glass, took a slow drink, and then looked at the Duke with the same flat patience he had turned on the guard at the station. He said, quietly, that he hoped the Duke's journey back to his province would be uneventful. He said it like a man reading a weather report. Then he picked his fork back up. 3 of the senior generals sitting farther down the table went very still. One of them put his own fork down and did not pick it up again for a full minute. The Duke said nothing more for the rest of the evening. Saraval watched all of this and felt something moving in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. It was not admiration. She was not ready to call it that. But it was something adjacent, something that sat near the place where admiration lived. She began to notice other things. Cole always arrived to shared functions on time, never early enough to seem eager, never late enough to be disrespectful. He spoke to the palace staff the same way he spoke to generals. He asked questions about Verith history with what appeared to be genuine interest, and he remembered the answers. He was, she realized, extremely difficult to dismiss. The message arrived on a quiet afternoon when Saraval was reviewing trade reports. It came through the diplomatic channel, flagged urgent. A faction of Verith separatists, furious at the peace terms, had seized a border relay station and were holding a group of human diplomatic staff hostage. The Empire's nearest response unit was 6 hours out. The humans were requesting communication but had not yet requested military intervention. Saraval read the message twice. Then she walked to Cole's chamber and knocked. He answered quickly. He had already read it. She could tell by his eyes, which were calm in a specific way, the kind of calm that is not the absence of thought but the presence of a decision already made. He asked her, very quietly and politely, where the palace armory was. Relay Post 9 was the kind of place that existed in the gaps between more important places. A long industrial facility anchored to a cold rock at the far edge of Verith-controlled space. It processed shipping manifests and relayed communications for a corridor of space that nobody particularly wanted but everybody needed. It smelled like machine oil and recycled heat, and it had the kind of silence that comes from being very far from anything that matters. Cole moved through the docking corridor like he had been there before. He had not been, but it did not seem to make any difference to him. He read the station's layout from a schematic on a small handheld unit, and then he folded it away and did not look at it again. Saraval walked 2 steps behind him. She had argued against coming. She had also, 20 minutes before the ship departed, changed into practical clothes and brought her own sidearm. She told herself she was there to oversee the diplomatic outcome. She told herself it had nothing to do with the fact that she did not entirely trust the situation to resolve itself cleanly without her. The Verith security escort that had been assigned to them was 6 soldiers, experienced professionals who had each seen real combat. They were good at their jobs. Saraval had worked with their unit commander before and trusted her judgment. The unit commander's name was Ketharaborn Dova, and she watched Cole for the first 10 minutes with the careful attention of someone who has decided to reserve her opinion until she has more information. That opinion, Saraval suspected, was shifting. Cole did not give orders. He made suggestions, quietly, and explained the reason for each one. He repositioned 2 of the soldiers without raising his voice, pointing out angles that the original formation left exposed. He asked Dova how her team preferred to move through confined corridors and actually listened to the answer before adjusting his own approach to fit theirs. They reached the intersection of the station. The Separatists had locked down 3 connecting passages and were holding the diplomatic staff in the main cargo bay. Cole studied the door seals for a moment, then looked at the ventilation grid above them, then looked at the floor. He told them his plan in 30 seconds. It was simple. Simple plans, he said, were the ones that worked when everything else stopped working. Dova looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. When the breach happened, Saraval was positioned at the rear corridor with 2 of the escort soldiers, covering the exit route as agreed. She heard the sounds of it before she saw anything. There was shouting, then a crash, then a period of quiet that felt very loud. Then Cole's voice, steady and carrying, telling everyone to stay calm and move toward the door. It was over in less than 4 minutes. She saw Cole afterward. He was helping one of the diplomatic staff, a young man who had been badly frightened, through the corridor toward the exit. He was talking to the young man in a low voice, not about what had just happened, but about something completely ordinary. She caught a few words. He was describing, for reasons she could not fathom, the best way to make a particular kind of bread. The young man was still shaking, but he was listening. By the time they reached the exit, he had stopped shaking. Cole leaned against the corridor wall near the dock entrance. He had 2 injuries. She could see one on his forearm, a cut that had bled through his sleeve, and another along his left side that he was holding with some tension in his posture but not making a sound about. He had a small pack with him, and he reached into it and took out a compact nutrition bar and ate it with the focused attention of someone completing a necessary task. One of Dova's soldiers said something to another in a low voice. Saraval heard it. The soldier said that he had watched the whole thing and the human had not been afraid. Not once. Not even in the moment where it had been closest. Dova said nothing. But she was looking at Cole in the way that soldiers sometimes look at other soldiers when they have recalibrated something important. Saraval walked over to where Cole was sitting against the wall. She stood in front of him for a moment. She had come prepared with a formal acknowledgement, the kind of thing she would say to a unit commander who had performed well. Something official. Something with the appropriate distance. What came out instead was a simple question. She asked if he was all right. Not as protocol. The words came out genuine and she could not pull them back. He looked up at her. His face was tired, but the eyes were the same as always, present and patient and missing nothing. He said yes, he was all right, and he smiled, and the smile was not performance. It was just a smile. She believed him entirely. That was the thing that stayed with her on the journey back, sitting in the transport while the stars moved past the window. She had believed him, completely and without question, and she was not sure she had ever believed anyone quite that easily before. 3 days later, the footage leaked to the Galactic press. Someone on the station had a recording unit active during the operation. The recording was incomplete, shaky, poorly lit, and it still made headlines across 6 species major news networks. The headline was not about the hostages. It was not about the diplomatic resolution or the separatist faction or the political implications for the peace treaty. It was about the human. It was about the way he moved. It was about the expression on his face, which was not the expression of a man doing something heroic. It was the expression of a man doing something ordinary. Every faction that had been watching the Verith-human peace process with calculating eyes had to sit down and reconsider what they thought they knew. The footage traveled faster than light, which was remarkable since light itself moved pretty quickly. Within 48 hours of the leak, it had been shared across every major galactic network and translated into 11 languages. Within a week, it had been analyzed by military commentators, political scholars, 3 independent security firms, and at least one poet who wrote a very long piece about the nature of human stillness that Saraval read twice and was not sure she fully understood. The reaction inside Kethera was divided in a way that mapped almost exactly onto existing opinions about the peace treaty. Citizens who had accepted the treaty were fascinated and, in some cases, visibly unsettled. Citizens who had opposed the treaty were furious. Not at Cole specifically, but at what the footage implied, which was that the species they had gone to war against was still a variable that nobody had fully calculated. The noble houses were quieter but harder to read. They watched. They waited. They scheduled meetings with each other and kept their public statements carefully neutral. General Dovrath, Saraval's uncle and the most vocal opponent of the peace agreement within the imperial family, used the moment to make his move. He submitted a formal security petition to the imperial court, arguing that a human with Cole's documented capabilities living inside the palace represented an unacceptable risk. He phrased it carefully, citing protocols and precedents, keeping his language clean and official. The petition came before the court on a gray morning when the city was wrapped in low cloud and the light inside the great chamber was the color of old bone. Dovrath presented his case with the confidence of a man who had prepared it well and expected it to succeed. Saraval let him finish. Then she stood. She did not raise her voice. She had learned that from watching Cole, though she would not have said so aloud. She laid out her counter, point by point, with the precision of someone who had spent the previous 3 nights preparing for exactly this exchange. She cited the treaty provisions that protected both parties within imperial territory. She cited the security escort's formal after-action report, which Dova had filed with specific language about the value of Cole's tactical contribution. She cited 3 separate historical precedents in which the Empire had welcomed Allied military personnel without petition or restriction. Then she looked at her uncle and said, clearly and without hostility, that the petition was denied and the matter was closed. The court did not erupt. Courts rarely erupted. But the quality of the silence that followed was the kind that meant everyone in the room had just updated their understanding of something important. Cole, who had not attended the session at Saraval's suggestion, was in the east courtyard when she returned. He was doing nothing in particular. He was sitting on the low stone bench near the old fountain, watching a small bird that had landed nearby, and he looked entirely unbothered by the fact that his continued presence in the palace had just been debated by a full imperial court. She told him how it had gone. He listened. He thanked her, simply and without drama. She asked him, standing there in the gray morning light, how many people had followed him into situations they probably should have walked away from. He thought about it. He did not answer quickly, which meant he was taking the question seriously. Then he said too many, and his voice was quiet when he said it, and the smile that usually lived somewhere near his eyes was gone. That answer stayed with her. That evening, she told him something she had not told many people. She told him about the war councils she had been excluded from in the early days of the conflict, when she had been considered too young and too female to sit at the table where real decisions were made. She told him about the battle maps she had studied in secret, borrowing files from her mother's military archives when the senior staff were occupied elsewhere. She told him that she had volunteered for the treaty marriage specifically because she did not trust any other member of the imperial family to manage it without making it worse. She said it plainly, without looking for sympathy. She was simply explaining herself, the way she had seen him explain his tactical choices to Dova's team at the relay station. Clear information. Offered without performance. He listened the way he always listened. Completely. Then he told her something in return. He told her about his first campaign, the one that did not appear in the public record. He told her what it had cost, and what he had learned from it, and why he had kept going anyway. They talked until well past midnight. The sitting room between their chambers, which had been empty and unused since their arrival, was where the conversation happened. Saraval did not notice until much later that they had both chosen to sit there without discussing it. Davrath, meanwhile, was making a different kind of move. The court petition had failed. He had expected that might happen. He had prepared for it. He reached out through private channels to a faction operating outside Imperial space, a group that wanted the peace treaty dissolved badly enough to act outside legal means. He offered them access. They offered him results. 3 days later, Saraval received a message from her intelligence contact. The contact was careful with words, and the message was brief. The threat was not to the treaty. The threat was to Cole specifically, timed for the upcoming convocation, planned to unfold in front of every noble house and visiting delegation. Saraval read the message 3 times. Then she sat very still for a long moment. Then she started making her own preparations. The grand convocation of the imperial noble houses happened twice a year, and it was one of the oldest traditions in the Vareth Empire. The great hall of the palace held over 1,000 people when fully arranged, with long tables running the length of the floor and the high family banners hanging from the ceiling in colors that had not changed in living memory. It was, by design, the most visible space in the most watched building in the empire. Which was why, Saraval understood now, her uncle had chosen it. She arrived early. She moved through the arrangement of the hall with the unhurried attention of someone doing a final inspection, which was not unusual for her and therefore did not attract notice. She greeted guests. She spoke to the visiting delegations. She noted which faces she knew and which she did not. Cole arrived exactly on time. He was dressed in the formal attire that had been prepared for him, a clean dark suit in the human style with a small Vareth insignia at the collar that had been Saraval's idea and that he had accepted without comment. He moved through the room the way he always moved through rooms, reading it, noting angles, filing things away behind eyes that appeared perfectly relaxed. He had known for 2 days. He had not told her. She had figured it out the night before. She had not told him. They had, independently and without discussion, each moved to protect the other. She found this both logical and, in a way she had not expected, deeply moving. The convocation began. There were formal readings, the presentation of trade agreements, a brief address from the High Court's chief representative. Saraval sat at the central table as tradition required, with the various house heads arranged around her. Cole sat 2 seats to her right. She had changed her seat that morning. Quietly, without explanation, she had shifted the arrangement so that she was positioned between Cole and the main hall entrance. Her chief attendant had noted the change and said nothing. Cole had noticed. She was certain of it. He had not said anything either. The serving staff moved through the room during the 3rd session. There were many of them, as there always were at convocation, and they moved efficiently and without drawing attention. The assassin was among them. Saraval had identified the likely candidate from her intelligence contact's description, a person carrying a particular kind of stillness that did not match the practiced ease of experienced palace staff. She was watching when Cole acted. He did not stand. He did not shout. He did not make a scene. He simply turned in his chair at the precise moment and spoke 2 quiet words to the person passing behind him. The words were not a threat. They were not a command. They were, from what she could piece together later, an observation about the weight distribution of the tray being carried, which was wrong for the items it appeared to hold. The assassin stopped, looked at him, made a decision, turned and walked, quickly, toward the nearest exit. 2 palace security personnel who had been quietly repositioned over the previous hour were waiting at that exit. The entire sequence took less than 30 seconds. Most of the room did not notice anything had happened. The convocation continued. Saraval stood 15 minutes later. She had considered the timing carefully. She stood during a natural pause between agenda items, when the room's attention was already shifting, and she asked for the floor. She spoke for 6 minutes. She laid out what she had learned, the contact with the outside faction, the financial records her intelligence contact had obtained, the specific chain of decisions that led from her uncle's failed court petition to the arrangement made for the convocation hall. She named Dovrath directly. She presented it the same way she presented everything, with precision, without performance, and without raising her voice. Dovrath sat at the far end of the table. He was very still. He had the look of a man watching a structure he had built carefully collapse at a point he had not expected, from a direction he had not thought to watch. The High Court representative called for an immediate review. 3 House heads seconded it before the echo of the words left the ceiling. The convocation was suspended. Dovrath was escorted from the hall by palace security, and he walked with them without resistance, because there was nothing else left to do. In the quiet that followed, while the hall slowly emptied and attendants moved through clearing the tables, Saraval and Cole ended up on the balcony that ran along the east side of the upper level. It overlooked the city. The lights of Kethera spread out below them in the evening dark, amber and gold, and the occasional cold blue of a commercial district still running at full capacity. She asked him when he had known that she had figured it out. He said he had suspected when she changed her seat at the convocation table to put herself between him and the main hall entrance. She said she had not realized she had done it consciously. He said he knew. He said it gently, without making anything more of it than the simple truth it was. She stood beside him and looked at the city and thought about the last several months. The greeting hall on the neutral station. The guard's pale face. The courtyard in the early morning. The corridor at Relay Post 9. The sitting room where they had talked until the building went quiet around them. The court session. The convocation. The two of them, separately reaching the same conclusion at the same moment and acting on it without needing to coordinate. The peace treaty was formally ratified the following week, with expanded terms that neither side had managed to agree on before. It was covered extensively across every major news network. The coverage focused on the political achievement, the diplomatic language, the historical significance. It did not cover what Saraval had learned, which was that peace between two species was not built in chambers or in documents or in ceremonies that lasted 20 minutes and smelled like recycled air. It was built in smaller things, in questions asked without an angle, in silences that did not need to be filled, in a hand reached for in the dark without a reason given, because some things did not require a reason. She reached over and took his hand. He did not say anything. Neither did she. The city burned quietly below them, and the stars above were very still, and there was nothing else that needed to happen that night.